So in this video, we are going to do the pre-lab for the very first experiment, which is percent composition of a copper penny. So before we get into the pre-lab itself, I want to talk about how to set up your lab notebook and the lab reports that you will be turning in. So if you take a look at the lab notebook and informal reports page, looks like this. Your lab notebook, which looks something like this. Most likely yours is going to be yellow. Your lab notebook is your record of all of the labs that you have done or you will do in AP Chemistry. Some colleges will ask to see your lab notebook to prove that you've done college level labs in our AP Chemistry course, which is why we do lab reports in these carbon copy lab notebooks. So when you are looking at your lab notebook, this lab notebook has duplicate pages. So they are carbon copy pages that you can remove to submit for me to grade. All of the pages that remain in the lab notebook, which have a blue color, those will stay in the notebook. You will be able to tear out the yellow pages, which are the copy pages, because they are perforated. Any other page will stay in your lab notebook. Even if you mess up, it stays in your lab notebook just as a record. Now, when you are writing in these lab notebooks, you have to write in ink. The reason that you want to make sure that you are writing in ink is so that as you are writing through the blue lab notebook page, it is going through onto the yellow copy page that you will be turning in. So if you are writing with pencil, you're not writing hard enough, and so it won't show up on the yellow page. And if you're not sure if you're writing hard enough, you can just flip over to the page and see if it's going through. So what we're going to do now is we are going to actually look at how to set up the lab notebook itself. So when you open the cover of your lab notebook, you should see a table of contents. You have a spot for your name, and then you notice that there is this table of contents. The first thing is to make sure that you're putting your name. You don't have to fill in everything else, but I do want you to put your name just in case you leave the lab notebook in our classroom, for example, and then I know whose it is. Then this table of contents, you want to keep a record of each lab that we do. So what you'll do is you'll put the date, typically that we do the pre-lab, and then the experiment number and just a brief title, and then the page number that it starts on. Now you're going to notice when I flip open to this lab notebook, I've used this for example lab notebook for years, and so I won't be starting on page 1. You should be starting on page 1 unless you have a used lab notebook, in which case you might start later in the notebook. And so what we're going to do is we'll put today's date, we will put experiment number 1, I'll do percent of CU, and then the page that it starts on. So if you're starting on page 1, you'll put a 1. If I flip my lab notebook open, I'm actually starting on page 41. So I will actually go ahead and put 41. Now, when you are in your lab notebook, you want to make sure that you don't ever skip pages in your notebook. You always want to make sure that you're going page 1, 2, 3, so on. If you mess up, you'll put a line through the page and then you'll flip to the next page. And then you can use as many pages as you need. You should have a 100-page lab notebook. We will not use all 100 pages, so use as many pages as you need for the lab. And then you want to make sure that you're never tearing out a permanent page. So these blue pages are the permanent pages. You never want to tear these out. Even if you mess up, you don't want to tear them out. You'll simply put a line through it and you'll flip to the next page. Now I'm going to flip to the page that I'm ready to start on. So you have this back flap. So I'm always going to call this the back flap of the notebook. You're going to notice as a periodic table, which a lot of students find really useful throughout the year. So if they have their lab notebook, they just flip open to this periodic table. Now, this is not just available for a periodic table. What this is this is a way to separate the page that you are writing on from the next page. And so what you want to do, if I'm starting on page 41, you're going to notice I have the permanent page and I have the copy page, right? Permanent page is blue, copy page is yellow. what I want to do is take both of these pages, lay the back flap down, and then lay the pages down. So this back flap is a way to prevent any writing from going through to pages 2, 3, 4, even 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by actually setting everything up. And what I'm doing is I am referencing this page that you have, which is the lab notebook and informal reports page. So I'm referencing this as we are actually going through and setting up our lab notebook. I'm also going to be referring to the actual lab handout itself. So you want to make sure that you have these 2 pages handy while you're watching this video, just to make it easier to follow along with everything that we are talking about. So now that we have our lab notebook ready to go, we want to make sure that we label everything appropriately. So at the top, on the first page of the lab, you want to make sure you fill this out completely. So this is experiment number 1. The experiment/subject, that's the title of the lab. So I typically give you the title of the lab right at the top of the page. So we know it's experiment 1. If you're not sure of the experiment number and I don't give it to you on the paper, just look back at your table of contents. That's the other reason that you have the table of contents. Now you don't need to write the experiment in its entirety, the title. I'm just going to do % CU in penny. So just enough so that we know what we're talking about. So the date, this is just today's date. So whatever date you are starting this, just do month, day, year. This doesn't have to be the day the lab starts. It could be whatever day you're doing the pre-lab. But as long as it should all be around the same time. And then your name. So make sure you do your first and last name, please. And so you have your name. So I'll write it here. And then once we get into class and you start working in lab, you will have a lab partner. If you are doing the lab on your own, so you're at home and you're doing the lab, for lab partner, you could just put a line through it. Please don't ever leave anything blank, because if you put a line through it, that tells me that you did the lab on your own. Or if you just want to put home, something like that, that's fine. And then locker desk number and the course and section number, you never have to fill those in. You will notice on the rubric for the lab, the notebook formatting is part of the point. So you do want to make sure that you're always filling everything in appropriately. As we're looking at our lab notebook, just a couple things to keep in mind. This will be messy. That's okay. The biggest thing is if you mess up, you use a single line to fix your error. So let's say I spelt penny wrong and I wanted to fix it. I put a single line and then write the word. Don't scribble it. You put a single line and then keep writing. That's okay, right? This is a work in progress, but you want to make sure that you are trying to be as neat as possible. And if you make a mistake, single line, move on. When you're ready to start experiment 2, you start on a completely new page. So if this takes you 2.5 pages, so you have page 1, 2, and 3, you're going to flip to page 4 to start your next experiment. So now let's go ahead and let's work on the pre-lab. So when we are looking at our lab notebook instructions, notice that for the pre-lab at the top of the first page, we've already filled in our information. A pre-lab is usually your homework. So the pre-lab is usually your homework the night before we start the lab. And this is to ensure that you know what you are doing when you enter lab. So we have purpose, procedure, pre-lab questions. So when we look at the lab handout, sometimes you will just be given the purpose. Sometimes you have to read the background information and find the purpose. So you want to make sure for the pre-lab that you are reading from the purpose all the way through the procedure. So if you need to, take just a minute and read from the purpose all the way through the end of the procedure. So once you've read through it, we're going to go ahead and start the pre-lab. So again, make sure you have the back flap down. So notice I'm on my page 41 And notice how it's gone through up at the top. So I'm going to start by writing purpose. You want this to be as neat as possible. Again, if you mess up, put a single line, continue writing. And so when I'm writing the purpose, this is just going to be hopefully a single sentence. You want to summarize. If it's a big paragraph for a purpose, I want you to summarize into 1 or 2 sentences. But if you are writing a whole paragraph, you've missed the point of paraphrasing. So usually it's just 1 sentence. So after reading, I have found that the purpose Okay, so the purpose of this lab is to determine the percent copper in a penny and perform stoich. There's my purpose. Again, if you would have messed up, you put a single line through and you keep writing. So then the next part of the pre-lab is the procedure. Now, a procedure is going to be either an outline or a flow chart of the procedure that you read in the handout. Do not copy the entire lab. You will be doing labs where you have maybe 50 steps in the procedure. I do not want you to write all 50 steps. I want you to paraphrase, but you want to make sure that it is understandable. So when you are writing out the procedure, you should be able to hand it to someone else and they should be able to do the lab. Now, when we're doing procedure, you're going to notice you have this solid line down the middle of your lab notebook. You're going to keep the procedure on just the left-hand side, because on the right-hand side, we're going to be putting something else. So for the procedure, I'm going to stick just on the left-hand side of the page, and I'm going to go ahead and use the lab handout to write out my procedure. Now I notice that this is a 2-day procedure, so I'm going to break it up and I'm going to say day 1. I am going to use a bulleted list for the procedure. If you want to draw pictures instead, that's fine. You want to do a flow chart somehow, that's fine. I'm just going to use a list. So the first thing it says to do is mass a pre-1982 penny. Now, the reason that we're doing more of this T-chart form is because on the right-hand side, this is where we're going to put data and observations. Now, the reason that we do this T-chart is because now where I have a step in the procedure, I can immediately put the data and observations on the other side. So if I'm finding the mass of a pre-1982 penny, one piece of data will be mass of pre-penny, and I'm going to put an equal sign with a blank and grams. Because now that I know that I'm going to be finding the mass, this is now telling me here's where I can put that mass. The second step, it says get a post 82 penny and record date. All right, so I know now I'm recording a date. So here I'll say date of post penny. And I'll put a blank. So notice now I have places that I'm going to be filling in data. Then it says to use a file to make 4 marks in a penny. So I'll say file 4 marks in penny. Now I'm going to draw a picture just to help me remember what I read. So I'm going to draw a penny, right? And it said to file the marks at 3, 6, 9, and 12 o'clock. And then use steel wool to make shiny. So steel wool. Right, and so again, notice I'm trying to stop right at this bold line. If I go over a little bit, it's not a big deal. Right, so then we're going to find the mass of the penny after we file it. So mass, the filed penny. So then over here, I know that's going to be a piece of data that I record. And I'm putting grams just so I remember that I should have units there. So Then it tells us to put the penny into a beaker and add about 20 milliliters of 6 milliliter HCl. So put penny in beaker and add about 20 milliliters of HCl. Now it's going to be really important when we're using acids or bases or really any kind of solution that we record the concentration. So I want to make sure to record the concentration of the HCl. So brackets means concentration. Sometimes the concentration will not be exactly what it says in the lab because sometimes I have to make the acid and I can't get it to exactly the concentration. So you always want to make sure that you're recording exact concentrations. So then it says cover with a watch glass and observe, leave the beaker under the hood for 24 hours. So I'm going to kind of just combine these two steps into one. So I'll say cover with watch glass, make observations, and leave for 24 hours. And so again, I'm going to be making observations. So I'm just going to leave myself space here. I'm going to label observations and I'll label it day 1. And so I'm going to just leave myself some space. So notice how my data and observations are not only numbers, they're not only quantitative, but they're also qualitative observations. So it's really important that your data and observations, you would rather record too much than not enough. You'd rather have too much information here than not enough. And so now what I want you to do is I want you to read day 2 and see if you can go through and you can create your procedure and your data and observations. So now we have our formatting, our purpose, and our procedure completed. We started looking and setting up data and observations, but I'm going to talk more about that in a second. So if we look at our lab notebook formatting page, the pre-lab is the purpose, the procedure, and then the pre-lab questions. Now I know that our lab handout for the first experiment is set up a little bit differently, but your order should always be purpose, procedure, and then pre-lab questions. So notice it says in some experiments, we will have pre-lab questions. These pre-lab questions will immediately follow the procedure. So what we're going to do is I have purpose, procedure. Now if you have space at the bottom to fit your pre-lab questions, you could put them at the bottom of the page. I don't think I will have space to complete the 3 pre-lab questions at the bottom of my page. So I'm going to actually go to the next page. So again, I have my blue page. Notice there's my copy page for what I just worked on. So I'm going to take both of those pages and flip it over, flip the back flap. Then I have page 42. I have the blue page and the yellow page. Put the flap down, and now I'm going to start on a new page. Now when you start on a new page, the only thing in terms of formatting that you need at the top is your name, just in case you staple your lab and one of the pages comes undone. So now the section that I'm ready for is pre-lab questions. So notice how I have every section labeled. Notice how it's nice and neat, it's easy to read. That's how every lab should be. So for the pre-lab questions, they do not need to be completed in complete sentences. Typically pre-lab questions will be math. And so if we look at the lab handout, the pre-lab questions are up here. So we have 3 pre-lab questions. We have a balanced equation, just a general question, and then it tells us to look up some prices online. So let's go ahead and let's look at pre-lab question number 1. So make sure that it's labeled so that it's easy for me to find. So the first pre-lab question says to write the balanced equation for the reaction of zinc and hydrochloric acid. So zinc, right, it's just zinc. Now I want us to get in the habit of thinking about states of matter. So zinc is a metal, metal is a solid, and hydrochloric acid. So now we're going back into naming. So an acid means it starts with a hydrogen. Hydrochloric means it's hydrogen and chlorine, +1 and -1. It's just HCl. All acids are always aqueous solutions. Now, if we look at this, we have a metal and we have an acid. This is a single replacement reaction. So my hydrogen and my zinc will switch. So that leaves hydrogen and zinc combining with chlorine. Now, when you form products, two things to remember. One, always remember your diatomic molecules. So whether you remembered it as H-Brofinkel, Brinkel, Hoff maybe is another one. I always taught it Braun H. Cliff. However you remember it, remember your diatomics. So hydrogen, when it's by itself, is H2. And then when you form a new compound, you want to make sure you check charges. So zinc is always +2, chlorine is -1. So when you switch those charges, it becomes ZnCl2. Now hydrogen, so most diatomic molecules are gases, with the exception of bromine and iodine. And then ZnCl2 is actually soluble, so it will be aqueous. So here's our equation. Now see if you can balance it. So check everything. You need a 2 in front of the HCl for it to be balanced. So there's Prelab question number 1. Prelab question number 2 says, why doesn't copper react with hydrochloric acid? So instead of zinc, if we put copper in there, this is actually no reaction, and it wants to know why. When you are dealing with single replacement reactions, you have to remember about the activity series. And so with the activity series, if copper doesn't react with HCl, that means it's not as active. That means that zinc is more active or copper is less active. So what we're going to say is copper is less active. It's always going to be less active than the other positive ion. So Cu is less active than H. So Cu will not react. You do not need to memorize the activity series, but it's good to know why some things react. So just knowing the why behind it. Now for number 3, I'm going to have you guys do this one on your own. So it says look up the prices of copper and zinc online. And so I want you to do copper and zinc, and I want you to find the price in dollars per pound. So for both of them, I want you to, you can just Google price of copper per pound, price of zinc per pound. And now we have our pre-lab. So we have the purpose, the procedure, and the pre-lab questions. Now, before you watch the lab video and you start filling in data and observations, I just want to talk a minute about what you're going to be putting in your data and observations section. So during an experiment, you're going to record all of the data and observations directly into your lab notebook. You're never going to write on a different piece of paper and transfer it. You want to record it directly in your lab notebook. You and your lab partner will have your own lab notebooks. So even if one of the partners is actually doing the reaction and the other one is writing down, that's fine. You can transfer and switch data, but you have to make sure everything gets recorded directly in your lab notebook. Make sure you are taking into account significant figures, so you're recording the scale exactly as it is. You have both qualitative and quantitative data. So qualitative is what do you see, what do you smell, what do you hear, and then quantitative is numbers. Calculations are not shown in data and observations. That's going to be a separate section after. And there will be times that you need a data table. So this experiment does not require a data table. We have the purpose, the procedure, data and observations. If you needed a data table, typically what I have people do is after the pre-lab questions, they'll write data and observations data table, and then they'll draw it in. We'll look at that on the next lab. So this is what you're going to fill in during the lab, your data and observations, and then we will look at the post-lab part of this sheet once we're ready to do calculations. So calculations, data analysis, post-lab questions, and conclusions, that is all part of the post-lab.